Don't you know, can't you hear, won't you see? Gene here, alive and living color right here on the YouTube. Bringing to you, Gene Has Concerns. Dark Side of the Ring, the Jeff Jarrett and TNA story. And wow, what a first half I got to see and got to talk about in the last episode of Gene Has Concerns about Jeff Jarrett and some of the things he's gone through with TNA and everything. But we're starting off something new with the second half of episode 1 of Dark Side of the Ring from last night. Now, first off, who the hell is this guy Gene? Well, I'm an old wrestling manager, referee from back starting in 84 underneath the great Malenko, and have been working off and on the independents up until last year when I was working with this guy right here, the Technical Alchemist David Mercury. That's with 2 E's and D, and you can find him on Facebook, so check him out. And been years and years and years of working with the independents and kind of gained some knowledge about pro wrestling, so I thought it'd be a good show for me to kind of go and talk about. And this isn't a review show necessarily. This is more of a companion show. I hope to give you a few extra tidbits that maybe weren't mentioned in the show or maybe someone didn't know. And definitely if you all know some things or if I get something wrong, definitely leave me a comment because I need to know where I make mistakes. I need to make those corrections. So I've been a booker. I've been a matchmaker. I've been the in front of the fans matchmaker, even though I wasn't really booking the matches, stuff like that for off and on for years. Let's jump right back into the episode. So HealthSouth implodes. That's where we left off, is HealthSouth implodes. Huge story. Their funding disappears. TNA's funding disappears. Everything nearly dies. And I did a little bit of research on it, and HealthSouth executives inflated the company's earnings by billions of dollars to meet Wall Street expectations. Executives admitted they simply made up profits by creating false accounting entries. So they were cooking the books, basically. And 15 former HealthSouth executives pleaded guilty, and many served prison time for their roles in the fraud. But here's the kicker. Richard Strushy, who was the one that Jeff Jarrett went to fund TNA, was acquitted in the HealthSouth accounting fraud criminal trial, but was later found civilly liable for the fraud in order to pay $2.87 billion. Don't know if he paid it or not. Didn't research it that much deeper. But he also later served about 5 years in federal prison for an unrelated Alabama bribery public corruption conviction. So if you want to go digging into that, be my guest. Leave me some comments on what you find about that. But he didn't go to jail for the initial fraud with HealthSouth, but he later on went to jail. So this may have been the biggest surprise of the episode for our younger fans because, you may not realize that you can't just start a wrestling company. You need money. And if you don't have your own money, you have some of your own money you can invest in, but you got to find some, not sponsors, but you got to find, well, as Jim Cornette lovingly said, money marks. You got to find someone to invest. You got to find investors and such. So that being said, many of y'all probably didn't even know that TNA almost died back then. Well, along comes Panda Energy. Probably was injury to Jeff Jarrett in the long run, but along comes Panda Energy. He was going back to his vendors, and Dixie Carter and her company were one of his vendors, saying, hey, look, this is where we stand. This is where we're at. I don't blame you, jump ship. But he did the honorable thing going back to people that he's supposed to be paying. And, Jeff gets another chance. She introduced them to her father and mother, and they helped save TNA. So that's pretty good. One thing largely missing is Dixie. She's not involved with this Dark Side of the Ring episode. She's not interviewed. In other interviews, she's viewed herself as bringing business experience to wrestling. That's what she's claimed. While many wrestling veterans believe she lacked the wrestling knowledge, which kind of we all know that. If you're not 5-10 years in the wrestling business working actively, you don't have the wrestling knowledge to be calling the shots in wrestling. And it was an interesting perspective that was missed in this because I really would have loved to have heard her side of the story, you know? And whenever one side isn't participating, you're only hearing one version of history. And it doesn't make it wrong. It just means it's incomplete. So, and Jeff has even said on, I think it was Chris Van Fleet, that he reached out to Dixie. They talked on the phone, and he mentioned this, coming to the show, and then he never heard back. So, and the producers flashed something on the screen that, she didn't respond to them. So, kind of sad that she wasn't able to give her side of the story or defend herself, whatever. But they have an investor, they continue on, and then they get Spike TV. It's a huge milestone. Real television, real momentum, an alternative to WWE is becoming a reality. Now, they were at midnight on, I think they said Saturdays on Spike TV, but still, that's television. And then that grew into 1 hour, and they got into prime time, and then that grew into 2 hours. And they've been on different networks ever since, but that was the big Kickstarter for television. And then they got that six-sided ring. My back hurts talking about the six-sided ring, and I've never bumped in one of those rings, just hearing the stories. But Jeff saw the six-sided ring while he was in AAA in Mexico, and he immediately saw it was something TNA could bring back and make their own, to kind of give it its own touch, make it its own. And with UFC, and they had the Octagon being very popular at the time, that it just kind of fit right in where they wanted to go with TNA, and instantly made TNA look different from WWE. And whether you like it or not, when you saw that ring, you knew you were watching TNA. It was just their brand. And from what I've heard from the boys and girls who've been in those type of rings and bumping around, including David over my shoulder here, the ropes are super tight, tighter than you can imagine. And then it's just a hard ring to bump in. It's a hard ring it's pretty solid. There's not much give there. So, yeah. But then you get Jeff. They're working with the NWA at the time. And Jeff's the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion. And he's booking himself that way with the permission of whoever was running NWA at that time. It wasn't very much of anything compared to what it was back in the day. But the fans criticized it. Cornette kind of explains why he was doing it that way. And Scott D'Amore explains the same way. And then Jeff explains. And basically, it was his way of doing it because he knows he's not going to walk out on himself. He knows he's not going to no-show himself. He knows he's going to do the right thing for the business. So that's why he was champion. And that makes sense from a true wrestling perspective, maybe not from a fan perspective or the smart marks, if you will. But, it makes sense in overall wrestling business. Now, a side note about Jeff Jarrett is back in 2003, 2004, I forget when, I was working with IPW, and he appeared on an IPW show in St. Petersburg, Florida, and it was where he was defending the NWA Championship against the IPW champion, Rod Steele. And let me tell you, he didn't come in and just beat the hell out of Rod and it was a squash match. No, he came in and he made Rod Steele look like $1 million, and still in the end, I believe he won. But either way, he walked away with the title and made Rod look good. And that's the way a champion should do. An outside champion coming in or an outside big name talent coming in to a small promotion, that's what they should be doing, is making your stars look good. And one of the things that IBW ran into a lot when they were booking was they bring out Abdul the Butcher and Kevin Sullivan and book them against each other. And I kept telling them, no, fans, they've seen that. Let's book Kevin Sullivan against your top guy or your champion, and make them look good. And they did with Jeff, but then they didn't do that again so much. So, but Jeff did his job the old school way. He didn't lose the belt, but he made Rod Steele look like $1 million. So, and hold on. When you own the company, it changes your perspective on how you need to do business. And you might think differently than just booking your friends and your favorite wrestlers. So, but then we get to his dad, Jerry Jarrett. And this really surprised me. But, you know, what I'm understanding, Jerry couldn't get along with the Carters, mainly Dixie. And he wasn't seeing eye to eye and with them. And there was other things going on in the background. And we get the Vince Russo deal and everything. And it's like, it was going down a different road than what Jerry believed pro wrestling needed to be. So what does Jerry do? Jerry figures out a way to leave TNA and get away with it. You know, he takes someone, I forgot the guy's name. I don't think they mention it either, but he gets someone and takes them to a Russian guy and takes them to WWE and gets photographed and put on WWE.com. Jerry Jarrett. So it kind of got him released from TNA. So future endeavored, as we like to say. So now I thought it was pretty ingenious of him, a great way to do it. I figured out exactly how to get out of it. But, you know, kind of sad for TNA that it was going in that direction. And I'll talk a little bit later about my thoughts on what was going on with TNA back then. But whether you agree with it or not, it's kind of old school promoter thinking, you know. And it's also sad that father and son got estranged from each other. One interesting thing I found out from listening to Jeff Jarrett's My World podcast is Jeff said his dad, Jerry Jarrett, and Dixie Carter never really got off the right foot. According to Jeff, when Dixie first came backstage, she immediately started telling Jerry how things should be done. Now, she's the president of the company. She has that right by title. But in the wrestling business, you don't even have the right to be back there. I'm sorry. You know, and Jerry's reaction basically, who the hell is that? And Jeff said they never really recovered from that first impression. So you're dealing with someone who, you know, went into a territory war back in the 70s and won, basically, and basically ran Nick Goulas out of business. And, you know, he's been doing it for so many years. And I think he's kind of right with how to do business. But then we get to Jeff's wife, Jill Jarrett. And, you know, unfortunately, she had cancer. It went in remission, and then she got it back. And they got 2 or 3 young kids, daughters, I believe. And this is probably the most emotional part of the episode. Jeff becomes her caregiver, and the TNA creative meetings start happening at home. And, you know, there's even a little bit of story about Taylor Swift, because she came and she played for his daughters there because she lived in Hendersonville too, and she was just starting off. So, and then Jill eventually passed away, and that's one of the other tragedies with Jeff is now, you know, he's lost Owen, like a brother to him. He is estranged from his father, has had shakeups with TNA, trying to deal with Dixie Carter and the Carters, and now loses his wife. And he's not grieving very well from what they say, from what he says. So, you know, it's not really about wrestling anymore. It's about his story of being a husband and a father and, you know, trying to make do, you know. And Panda becomes a majority owner of TNA. Dixie Carter becomes the public face of TNA. And Jeff Jarrett, he remains a shareholder, but he's not in as much power. He's running the wrestling side of it, but he's just not able to do the business side of it like probably thought he was going to be doing. And Jeff later said on Insight with Chris Van Fleet that he reached out to Dixie. Oh, yeah, I said that already. He reached out to Dixie to participate. So let's see here. Money Mark. I mentioned that earlier. And Jim Cornette explains Money Mark to a T. But that's someone who they have money they want to invest. They want to run shows. They want to do something. And a wrestling promoter or booker or whoever gets a hold of them and yeah, we can do this, that, and the other. And sometimes it doesn't end out for that investor, end up good for that investor. Try that again. However, there's been some instances that it has worked out for a while. This one worked out for a while. But, several talking heads in this said that Dixie genuinely wanted to learn, and others felt, other veterans felt, they kind of quickly realized that she could be influenced and that influence could help them out. So, going out to the bar afterwards, having a party afterwards, whatever, and, kind of instead of the hey bro method, hey brother, it became the hey Rube type deal where, they can get better deals on their contracts or get shown more on TV, whatever, by buying Dixie wine and buttering her up and everything like that. So, but TNA had found its footing. Spike TV, it was a rating success. Momentum was building. They were kind of becoming a legitimate number 2. And this is probably the strongest of TNA, in history. And it was looking up to this point. And even Kurt Angle comes on board. He signs. Jeff went and convinced Bob Carter, Dixie's father, that this is what you got to do. You want total nonstop action. This is the guy. He's a wrestler's wrestler. And calls him a wrestling machine. And Kurt immediately legitimizes TNA. And this is the biggest signing of the company in company history. That Kurt coming off WWE and all his success there, and coming off the Olympics, that gold medalist. Kurt wasn't a nostalgia act. He was more of a let's get it done type wrestler, an impactful wrestler, if you will. And Kurt Angle's often said that TNA allowed him to continue wrestling when WWE wouldn't medically clear him. And we've seen that with other wrestlers that they've come back and got medically clear and wrestled, or wouldn't and go somewhere else, then come back, stuff like that. But, it became one of the defining moves for TNA. And the company expands. They get into video games, action figures, dolls, as we called them in the 80s, international growth, merchandise, and the TV going to 2 hours. Everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. They had the Knockouts division. And these ladies were beating the crap out of each other sometimes. They were talented. They were motivated. They were main event storylines. They were getting more television time. Austin Khan became the cornerstone, and Gail Kim, respectfully. And then, long before there was a women's revolution, there was TNA, and they were proving that women could get the job done. They could main event. And the Beautiful People and other women like that were really, making a mark on wrestling. And Jeff's personal life. Let's go into that a little bit. TNA reaches new heights, but he's still grieving Jill. And, excuse me, he's grieving, I'm sure he's grieving his father because they didn't speak for several years. And of course he's grieving Owen Hart, but he's not fully grieving. He's kind of holding on to it, but working. Let's get the job done. And he's not really taking that time to let go and let his feelings do what they need to do. And Jeff mentions he put on a mask every day, and wrestling became his escape. And his money was also on the line because he did still have an investment into it, and that's where he's making his money from. He couldn't simply just stop because he had a family to feed. And, there's other livelihoods involved with this company too. He couldn't just shut down the company because, hundreds of people were relying on those paychecks also. And then we run into Dixie wanting more control. Jeff notices Dixie replaced him on calls. He mentioned that he was going to be on I think it was a video game call or something. And they said, well, you don't need to be on the next one. Dixie's going to take over. He realizes that power dynamic shifting, and he believes she's prepared to take control. And this seems to be the first point where Jeff realizes this isn't just business anymore. More WWE talent arrives. And some contribute, and some are accused of just garnering a paycheck. They're just showing up. They're just on TV, and then that's it. And this became a morale issue where you got the old school TNA guys that helped build the company are having to play second fiddle to the WWE rejects, if you will, coming in and showboating and taking over the place. And that's, that's kind of concerning. If I had been there, and if I'd been, a young star in TNA, and all of a sudden I'm not getting booked as much TV time because we got to make room for so-and-so and such, for them to stand there and sit on a couch and talk, it's like, well, shoot, I could have had a 5-minute match, 10-minute match, just showing off the X Division or whatever. But it's the way things were going. So homegrown talent began feeling overlooked, that's for sure. And the TNA's biggest strengths were creating stars, AJ Styles, and what they did with Samoa Joe, making him bigger, and what Kurt Angle did to make Samoa Joe bigger. Beer money, what they did with that. American, forgot what they were called now. LAX, homegrown talent that they were building. And then bringing established names in, like I said with Jeff Jarrett before, coming to IPW, bringing these established names, but utilizing them to make your guys look better, make your stars look better. And that's not necessarily what they were doing. And eventually it may have slowed the development of the talent who built TNA. So then there's the creative power struggle. Jeff controls wrestling, Dixie controls business. Russo claims he's caught in the middle. Conflicting visions began affecting the product, and this is where the cracks become more visible. And then Karen Angle, that whole situation. Jeff ended up marrying her, but rumors began circulating they were having an affair. And according to Jeff and Karen, Jeff and Karen, they weren't having an affair because she had already split up from Kurt Angle. So, they're already separated. And Jeff says that their relationship started long afterwards. And one thing I appreciate is that Karen's even in the documentary because she's able to tell her side. Unlike Dixie. And whether you agree or disagree, it's important to hear directly from the people that were involved. And I also remember hearing those rumors back in the day, and I thought they were having an affair on Kurt. So, but then that's what became the breaking point. It's people get involved. They're out in public, or they had that party that Dixie was invited to, and that's where she saw they were together. And it's like, it really isn't anybody's business, but in a corporate world, I guess it still it was enough of a point that Dixie could use this to get total control of TNA. Let's put it that way. It's about the nicest way I could say it. And someone that was already looking for a move, that was a perfect timing. So she found out about it. Russo says Dixie called him furious because nobody told her while everybody else seemed to know what was going on. And then the story reaches the wrestling dirt sheets, and it kind of gets framed that this is the moment Dixie had the foothold to sideline Jeff. So the Panda Energy documents, they removed Jeff from his power. Lawyers say that they told him, Jeff says the lawyers told him he's being sent home with pay. At least they were paying him. Dixie's side from archival comments, is that the personal situation affected the company and put everyone in a difficult position. I don't see that, but I wasn't there. But I don't see how this relationship with a talent who actually been pulled back as a talent a little bit from what they said, it goes on today. I just don't see where there was really an issue with that, except for Dixie trying to get power. If you believe differently, tell me in the comments. Tell me why you believe that in the comments. But Jeff definitely saw it as a power play. The locker room sees the heart wrestling side being removed. So this part where the business and the personal completely clashed with each other. It just, I don't know. Jeff's frozen out, and Karen says Jeff is crushed. She felt responsible and even told him they should end the relationship. And of course, he said no. They eventually got married. And from 2002 to 2009, Jeff says that September 2009, Jeff says that TNA was his vision. And once he was pulled from that, that was it. And Jeff believes Dixie wanted to prove she could run the company herself. I can understand Dixie is a president wanting to run things, but because that's her title, but let the wrestling people run the wrestling side, you run the business side, and you oversee what they're doing without telling them how to do it. That's the way I believe. And that's the way I've worked with people before. It's the way I've worked with Money Marks before when I wasn't booking, but just helping out and stuff like that, that you kind of, they stay in their lane. They like to see this. Someone's got to explain to them why that won't work, why it doesn't make sense. And they're paying you to trust you to give them the right information. But I guess she didn't want that anymore. So anyway, Dixie takes control. Russo gets more power. He's in charge now. Jeff's sidelined. Dixie gives Vince Russo all the control he wants. Dutch Mantel, who was Jeff's right-hand man, gets fired. Cornette says Dutch had been Jeff's right-hand man and backbone of the wrestling ideas for a long time. And the documentary kind of frames it that it was a Jeff cleansing, so to speak. And I wish they had been able to get Dutch on here to speak. I don't know why not. He does have his own podcast, but might have been something going on that he couldn't. But his voice feels like a missing piece here. And Corny kind of does fill in that gap a little bit, but not enough. And speaking of Corny, now we get to the favorite part. If you ever listen to Jim Cornette Experience or, what's his other one? The Drive-Thru, Jim Cornette. Goodness, how could I forget that? You hear him talk about Vince Russo? Oh, wow. He's hated the man since like 1986 or 1996, 1997 when they met. Cornette attacks Russo's creative style. Russo says Cornette doesn't understand television. He's been doing television, as I just heard on one of his shows. It might have been an earlier podcast from years ago because I can go back to YouTube and listen to some of those old ones. But Teeny one time came up to him when he's 13 years old and said, I heard there was an issue with the Louisville television program where it got cut off 15 minutes early. He said, yes, ma'am, it did. She said, can you keep track of that for me? So a 13-year-old kid with OCD sat there with his dad to watch, started it, and took, show intro, 45 seconds, at the desk, 30 seconds, in the ring announcer, and he's writing out a run sheet for TV, and he doesn't even know he's writing out a run sheet for TV. So, and he gives it to Teeny, and she says, wow, this looks like one of the run sheets, and he thought she was just being nice until 6 years later when he's in wrestling as a manager, and he sees a run sheet. He's like, shit, this is like what I did. So, anyway, it's an old feud. It gets dragged out in the middle of TNA. They don't get along. There's other Jim Cornette podcasts where he talks about all the stuff, all the headbutting in TNA. and, trying to work with Jeff to work around Vince Russo and stuff like that. And Russo claims Cornette made a serious threat to him one time. Cornette says he even called the FBI on him. And Cornette says just wrestling talk, And I mostly know Cornette's side. I don't listen to Vince Russo and his podcast or whatever. But Cornette's even been reading letters recently that he wrote to Jeff Jarrett, faxed to him when Jeff wanted his feedback on the TNA shows. And he'd go down the show and this was good, this wasn't good. And one of those papers he was reading, there were 2 or 3 wrestling matches in a 2-hour show. The rest was all the other backstage stuff and in the ring promos and this, that, and the other and big-eyed schmoss. And I wasn't watching all that stuff back then. But it was like Jerry Springer, he says. So, and never was a big Russo fan. Like I said before, Cornette still to this day says he's going to piss on Russo's grave if Russo dies first. So, and then I just kind of think that for Russo to call the FBI over banter, over wrestling talk, over one guy's bullshit lines to you, he's just a flaming idiot. I'm sorry. Bottom line, a flaming idiot. So, and he's even had to take a restraining order out. Go find Jim on YouTube and look up his restraining order. You'll hear all that stuff. Jim has taken a restraining order and made copies of it and has sold it on his website. That's how funny it is. So anyway, people talk trash in wrestling. It's just a given, I mean, I've done it. Other guys have done it, and I've never taken offense to it. I don't remember anything anybody has said to me in wrestling that I've taken offense to in over 40 years. In promos or in the locker room or, in the ring, I just don't get it. So, and sometimes it's just emotionally charged comments coming out. And a little bit later, it's like, what you said about me? Oh, what'd I say about you? I don't even remember. So, literally, I've heard that before. So, I don't know. Doesn't mean it's to be taken that someone's going to kill somebody. In my opinion, Russo, like I said, flaming idiot. But he helped get Jim Cornette fired. So, anyway, then when Dixie needs Jeff to come back. What do you know it? She's going to go meet Hulk Hogan in Tampa. Wants Jeff to come with her. And they go meet Jeff. Jeff says that showed him he's still needed. And Karen says Jeff believed this might be his way back in. And this is one of the stranger parts. You push the founder aside, then you call them back when you need credibility for a major meeting. That's basically what that was. So, and the meeting with Hogan and surprise, Bischoff. And Jeff and Dixie fly to Tampa. Hogan is there. Bischoff is there. Bischoff says Hulk wanted him involved to protect his character. I think it's more of, hey, brother, might be able to get you a deal here too. They want to work with me. That's what I kind of think it is. So Jeff says the meeting showed him Hogan had no real understanding of TNA. None whatsoever. And Jeff's view, Hogan as a mouthpiece would have been great for TNA, but nothing beyond that. And we'll find out. Now, I got a side bit I got to talk about real quick. Not knocking the show, but kind of knocking Vice and their graphics people. The graphic comes up in the lower left-hand corner, a little bug. It says, next week, Jeff Jarrett and the Battle for TNA Part 3. Because they did a double episode last night, and then they're doing, or Tuesday night, and then they're doing a follow-up next week. And what do they show? It's a bug. Is that Tex sitting in the middle of a boxing ring. 4 ropes, and the long pad in the corners. I mean, do these people not know what a wrestling ring looks like? Okay. Anyway, Jeff says when Hogan and Bischoff came in, he knew his time TNA was ending. And Karen says Jeff was used for the meeting and then sent home again. So now, got a couple of things I want to give you, a few tidbits. One quick update before we go. I came across the interview with Dark Side of the Ring co-creator Evan Husney, and he said Tony Khan wasn't originally expected to be a part of the TNA story. It actually came together after Jeff Jarrett suggested him having Tony and talk about his work at AEW. And Husney said Tony is a genuine fan of the series and was happy to participate. So next week's episode won't be just about Hogan and Bischoff. Tony Khan's going to be on, kind of give his perspective, looking back as well. So now I got a question for you. Please put in the comments. Give me an answer to this question. Do you think TNA would have become a true competitor to WWE if Hogan and Bischoff had never joined? You might need to watch part 3 of this series just to see exactly what transpires, what unfolds, and be able to answer that from there. But definitely leave it in the comments. And until next time, just remember, Gene has concerns.